The lantern was still burning on her porch when Henrietta Merritt finally understood what Monroe Lockhart had never been able to say out loud. She stood in the doorway of the little house she rented from Widow Calloway at the edge of Redemption Creek, her boots still dusty from the road, her heart hammering against her ribs like a thing trapped and desperate to get free. The night was absolute around her, the kind of black that swallowed the Texas hill country whole, and yet there it was, the lantern. Hanging from the iron hook beside her door, its flame warm and steady and impossibly faithful, just as it had been every single evening for the past 4 months without exception or explanation. She had asked him once, just once. She had stopped him in the general store on a Thursday morning in early October, her hands full of thread and her cheeks burning, and she had said, "Mr. Lockhart, I want you to know that I appreciate the lantern, but I cannot allow you to continue." And he had looked at her from beneath the brim of that battered hat, those gray eyes steady and unreadable as a winter sky, and he had said only, "The road between town and your place is dark, Miss Merritt. That's all it is." And then he had tipped his hat and walked away, and she had stood there holding her thread and her breath and something she did not have a name for yet. But tonight she did have a name for it. Tonight everything had a name. Because tonight, Clement Farrow had come to her door with a lantern of his own, his expensive suit and his expensive smile and his hands full of promises about the land deal and what it would mean for her. And he had let slip, the way men like him always did when they thought a woman was too afraid to fight back, that Monroe Lockhart was the man standing between the Farrow Land Company and everything they needed. That Monroe's quiet was not weakness. That Monroe's silence about the property dispute was not acceptance. That Monroe Lockhart, the man who said nothing, owned every secret in Redemption Creek that could burn Clement Farrow to the ground. And Clement Farrow had come to her, specifically to her, because he believed he had found Monroe's only vulnerability. Her. The lantern flame flickered in the October wind, and Henrietta pressed her hand flat against the door frame to keep herself standing, because the revelation that she was Monroe Lockhart's hidden weakness was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most breathtaking thing anyone had ever told her. She was not a woman who came undone easily. She had crossed half the country alone after her father's death in Virginia. She had taken a teaching position in a town that did not particularly want a school teacher, and she had survived her first year in Redemption Creek, Texas, on determination and very little else. She did not come undone. And yet, she looked at the lantern, and she thought about all the evenings she had walked home from the schoolhouse in the gathering dark, and all the evenings that light had been waiting for her, warm and certain, as if someone in this indifferent country had decided that her safety mattered and had acted on that decision without asking for anything in return. Without asking for her gratitude or her attention or her hand, just the lantern, just the light. She had to go to him. She had to warn him. She had to look him in the face and ask him all the questions she had been too proud and too frightened to ask, because Clement Farrow was not a man who made idle threats, and Monroe Lockhart, for all his quiet competence, did not know what was coming. The year was 1878, and Redemption Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that could turn on a man overnight. She took the lantern from its hook, turned its light into the dark road, and walked. To understand why that walk meant everything, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the September afternoon 4 months earlier when Henrietta Merritt first arrived in Redemption Creek on the back of a mail coach that smelled of horses and dust and bad luck, with a carpet bag, a trunk of books, and a letter of appointment from the county school board that she had fought 3 other applicants to obtain. She was 26 years old, and she was starting over, which was the only thing she knew how to do. Redemption Creek sat in a fold of the Texas hill country between 2 limestone ridges, the kind of town that had sprung up around a spring and a stubborn streak of human hope. There was a main street with the general store, the saloon, a barber shop, a livery, the sheriff's office, a bank that had survived 1 robbery and was proud of it, and a church that doubled as the schoolhouse on weekdays. The town was surrounded by ranches, some struggling, some thriving, and the whole arrangement was held together by the water rights to the creek itself, which was the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. That single fact, which seemed like geography to most people, was actually the loaded gun that everyone in Redemption Creek was pointing at everyone else. Henrietta did not know any of this when she arrived. What she knew was that her trunk was heavy, the coach driver had deposited her on the street without assistance, and the September sun was brutal. She was wrestling the trunk toward the sidewalk when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find a man standing there. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that outdoor work made a person lean and weathered, with gray eyes and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 days. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that were quality leather despite the dust on them, and he had a horse tied at the rail nearby. He looked at her, and then at the trunk, and then at her again. "You need help with that," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am managing," Henrietta said, because she had learned that accepting help from strangers in new places required a certain careful assessment first. He nodded. He did not argue, and he did not leave. He simply took hold of the other handle of the trunk with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided a thing and was going to do it, and together they lifted it onto the boardwalk. Then he straightened, touched the brim of his hat, and said, "Monroe Lockhart. I have the Lockhart Ranch about 2 miles east of town." "Henrietta Merritt," she said, slightly out of breath. "I am the new school teacher." Something moved across his face that she could not read, something quiet and considering, and then he said, "The schoolhouse is the white building with the blue door 2 blocks north. The school board chairman is a man named Jasper Prout. He is going to tell you his opinion of women teaching. You do not have to agree with him." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and looked at her with those level gray eyes. "Where are you staying?" "Widow Calloway's boarding house." "I know where that is." He carried the trunk to Widow Calloway's without being asked, set it down in the front parlor, and left. He did not stay, and he did not make conversation, and he did not look at her the way men in new towns sometimes looked at a single woman traveling alone, that calculating, assessing look that she had learned to recognize and brace against. He simply helped and then was gone, and Henrietta stood in the parlor of the boarding house looking at her trunk and thinking that she did not quite know what to do with a person like that. She found out about the lantern 6 days later. It was the evening after her first full week of teaching, and she had stayed late at the schoolhouse, helping 3 of the older boys who were behind in their reading. By the time she locked the blue door behind her and turned toward the road south to Widow Calloway's, the sky had gone from orange to purple to a deep, dense black. The road between the schoolhouse and the widow's place ran along the edge of town, where the street lamps did not reach, past a stretch of scrub oak and limestone rock that felt considerably less friendly in the dark than it did in daylight. Henrietta was not the sort of woman who frightened easily, but she was also not foolish enough to pretend that darkness in an unfamiliar place carried no risk. She had walked perhaps 100 yards into the dark when she saw it. The lantern was hanging from a low branch of the live oak that stood at the corner where the road bent south, the one she passed every single day. It was a good lantern, the glass clean, the oil fresh, the flame steady and well-trimmed. It cast a warm circle of light across the road and the gravel, and it illuminated a small note folded and tucked into the bark of the tree. She took the note down. It said in plain, square handwriting, "The road is uneven past the bend. The light will see you to the widow's gate." There was no signature. She carried the lantern home and hung it on the hook beside the widow's front door as she went inside, thinking about square handwriting and gray eyes and a man who said very little but apparently acted considerably. The next evening the lantern was there again, and the evening after that, and every evening thereafter. She tried to catch him at it. She tried staying late and leaving early and varying her route and watching from the schoolhouse window at dusk. She never saw him. The lantern simply appeared, reliably and without ceremony, hanging on the live oak at the bend in the road, its flame fresh and ready, as if the darkness itself had decided to make an exception for Henrietta Merritt. She asked around carefully, without wanting to seem either desperate or romantic about it. Widow Calloway, who was the kind of woman who noticed everything and judged nothing, confirmed that yes, she had seen Monroe Lockhart ride past on the South Road at dusk on several occasions. The general store owner, a cheerful man named Amos Pickett, mentioned that Monroe had bought a quantity of lamp oil at the start of September that seemed excessive for one man living alone. The school board chairman, the opinionated Jasper Prout, mentioned with disapproval that Monroe Lockhart was a man who minded other people's business too often, which Henrietta privately translated as meaning that Monroe Lockhart was a man who minded justice when other people preferred to look away. This was when she began to understand that the lantern was not a simple or impulsive gesture. It was a considered one. It was a decision made by a man who had looked at a situation, identified a problem, and quietly solved it without fanfare or expectation, which was, she was beginning to realize, the essential character of Monroe Lockhart in all things. Redemption Creek was not, as she had initially hoped, a town at peace. It was a town holding its breath. The tension became apparent to her in pieces, the way things always became apparent in small communities, through overheard conversations and meaningful silences, and the things people said when they thought she was not listening because she was only the schoolteacher and schoolteachers were furniture. The Faro Land Company had been buying up properties in the hill country for 2 years. Clement Faro, who operated out of San Antonio with a lawyer and a land agent, and a reputation that preceded him like a cold wind, was quietly acquiring water rights and ranch land through a combination of legitimate purchase, legal pressure, and methods that people described in vague terms while looking at the floor. Several small ranchers had sold out under circumstances that were technically voluntary and practically were not. The water rights to Redemption Creek itself were the ultimate prize, because whoever held those rights held the town. Monroe Lockhart's ranch sat on 30 acres that bordered the creek on the east side. He held a portion of the water rights in partnership with 2 other ranchers, a Mexican family named Delgado and an older man named Samuel Birch who had been in the hill country since before the war. These 3 together controlled enough of the creek's access to make any large-scale development by the Faro Company impossible without their cooperation. The Delgados had already been pressured into a sale through a series of legal challenges to their land title that were built on deliberately obscure and dubious interpretations of post-war Texas land law. It was the kind of injustice that was perfectly legal and perfectly corrupt, and the Delgados had not had the resources to fight it. They had taken the money, which was less than the land was worth by half, and they had moved their family to San Antonio, or at least they had relations to land on. Samuel Birch had resisted for a year. His resistance had been met with fence cutting and a suspicious fire in his barn that could not be definitively attributed to anyone. He was an old man and he was tired, and Henrietta had heard him in the general store in October telling Amos Pickett that he did not know how much longer he could hold. That left Monroe. Monroe Lockhart held his portion of the water rights, and a quiet stubbornness that Clement Faro had apparently not anticipated and could not seem to crack. He had refused every offer, attended every legal proceeding regarding the rights with a lawyer he had hired from Austin at considerable personal cost, and continued to simply be present and immovable in Redemption Creek in a way that frustrated people who expected resistance to come with noise. Henrietta had learned all of this by November, partly through her own observation and partly through the confidence of the Delgado children, 2 of whom had been her students before their family's departure, and had told her things in the frank, unconscious way children told things they had overheard from adults. She had learned it and she had turned it over in her mind, and she had felt the particular anger of someone who recognized injustice but did not yet know what to do about it. She had also, in the quiet and private interior of her own heart, begun to feel something about Monroe Lockhart that she was not certain she was ready to name. It was not simply gratitude for the lantern, though the lantern was part of it. It was something that had accumulated in small moments. The way he sat in church on Sundays in the back row and listened to the sermon with the careful attention of a man who took ideas seriously. The way he spoke to his ranch hands, a crew of 4 that included 2 Mexican vaqueros, a former Buffalo soldier named James Coles who had come west after his military service, and a boy of 19 named Pete who was learning his trade, with a consistent and unremarkable respect that was rarer in Redemption Creek than it should have been in 1878. The way he looked at the land, not with the acquisitive hunger she saw in Clement Farrow's eyes, but with something that resembled actual love for a place. And the way he sometimes looked at her, those brief, unguarded moments when she caught those gray eyes on her across the street or across a room, and the look in them was so careful and so private, and so contained that it made her chest ache. She had told herself repeatedly that she was projecting, that she was a woman alone in a new place, and she was attaching significance to kindness because she was starved for it. She had told herself that Monroe Lockhart was a private and solitary man who probably behaved with equal consideration toward any neighbor in need, and that reading meaning into a lantern was the kind of thing that would embarrass her later. She had told herself all of this, and then Clement Farrow had come to her door on a cold November evening with his expensive lantern and his expensive smile, and he had told her the truth about what Monroe meant to his plans, and everything she had told herself evaporated like morning water on August stone. Farrow had been smooth about it. He was always smooth. He had come in his good coat with his hat in his hands, and he had talked about the future of Redemption Creek, and the prosperity that development would bring, and how a schoolteacher's salary was a modest thing, and surely a woman of her intelligence could see the opportunities that a properly capitalized company could create for education in the region. He had talked for 20 minutes and said nothing, and then he had made his real purpose known with the particular elegance of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone in the room. He needed her to talk to Monroe, to use whatever influence she had, and he said this with a smile that made her skin crawl, to encourage Monroe to reconsider the offer. The water rights, properly managed by Farrow's company, would benefit everyone. Monroe was being stubborn and old-fashioned, and frankly, Farrow said, leaning forward with the air of a man sharing a confidence, Monroe Lockhart's attachment to that particular piece of land, and that particular arrangement of rights was less about sound financial judgment than it was about sentiment. And sentiment, Farrow said, smiling at her in a way that meant he was not smiling at all, could be managed if one understood what a person was sentimental about. Then he said, because he could not entirely help himself, that it was interesting, was it not, how Monroe had never paid particular attention to any woman in Redemption Creek in 3 years of living there, and now suddenly the schoolhouse road acquired a lantern every evening, and Monroe Lockhart was buying lamp oil by the gallon. It was interesting, was it not, what a man would protect. He had left after that, confident and well-dressed and deeply wrong about what he had accomplished, because he had come intending to use her as leverage, and instead he had handed her the most important piece of information she had ever received, and he had not even known he was doing it. Henrietta had stood in the doorway for a long moment after his carriage pulled away, looking at the lantern and thinking about secrets and hidden motives, and the particular cruelty of people who used other people's love as a weapon. And then she had taken the lantern and walked east toward the Lockhart ranch with her heart in her hands, and the night pressing close on every side. The road to Monroe's ranch was 2 miles of limestone and cedar, and she knew every foot of it from daylight walks she had taken on weekends when she explored the country around Redemption Creek, learning the land the way she learned everything, methodically and with full attention. In the dark, with only the borrowed lantern, it was different. The shadows between the cedar trees were absolute, and the sound of her own boots on the road was the loudest thing in the world, and twice she startled at the movement of deer in the brush. But the lantern held and she held, and by the time she saw the lights of the ranch house through the trees, she had made her decision about what she was going to say. She was going to tell him the truth, all of it. She was going to tell him what Pharaoh had said, and what Pharaoh had intended, and what she had understood from it, including the part about herself, because she was not a woman who managed through evasion, and she was not going to start now. The ranch house was a solid limestone structure, 2 stories, built to last, with a long porch across the front and a barn to the east that glowed faintly from the lamp inside. A dog announced her from the porch, a big red hound that Monroe quieted with a word from the doorway before Henrietta had crossed the gate. He came out onto the porch and looked at her across the yard, and even at that distance she could see the surprise in his face, which was the first time she had seen him surprised by anything. "Miss Merritt," he said. His voice was careful. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, and she held up the lantern. "I need to speak with you. It is urgent, and I apologize for the hour, but I think it cannot wait." He held the door open without asking why, which was exactly what she would have expected from him, and she walked into the front room of Monroe Lockhart's house for the first time. The room was plain and clean and entirely itself, the way the man was plain and clean and entirely himself. A stone fireplace with a good fire, a table with 2 chairs, one pushed slightly back from the other, a book lying open on the table and a cup of coffee beside it, a rifle above the mantel and a working man's coat on the hook by the door, and a window with clean glass that looked out onto the dark yard. It was not a lonely room, she thought. It was a room that had made peace with simplicity, which was different. He poured her a cup of coffee without asking, set it in front of her, and sat down across the table. He did not fill the silence with anything. He simply waited, those gray eyes steady, while she found her starting place. She told him everything. She told him about Pharaoh's visit and his proposition and his smooth, careful language, and the way he had let his real purpose show through like bones under thin skin. She told him about the implication that she could be used as leverage because of Monroe's apparent attachment to her safety. She told him that Pharaoh was watching both of them, and that he believed Monroe's care for her was a vulnerability he could exploit. She was watching Monroe's face as she said all of this, and his face was doing something she had not seen before. It was not quite anger, though anger was underneath it. It was a contained and ferocious protectiveness that had nowhere to go and was therefore turning itself inward, and it was the most expressive his face had ever been in her presence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told you sooner." "Told me what exactly?" she said, though she was fairly certain she knew. He looked at the table and then at her, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had kept something behind a door for a long time and was now opening the door and would deal with the consequences. "That I have been watching out for you since you arrived, and that it is not entirely the action of a neighbor being neighborly." A pause. "I did not intend to put you in any danger. I did not think Pharaoh would notice. That was careless on my part. You are not responsible for what Clement Pharaoh notices or does not notice," Henrietta said. "I am responsible for you being in that man's calculations." "Mr. Lockhart," she set her coffee cup down. "Clement Pharaoh put me in his calculations because I am the school teacher and I speak to most of the town, and he thought I might be useful. The lantern may have sharpened his interest, but the interest would have existed regardless. Please do not take credit for Pharaoh's predatory instincts." Something changed in his face. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but something adjacent to it. "You are remarkably clear-headed for someone who just walked 2 miles alone in the dark." "I had a lantern," she said. "Yours, as a matter of fact." The almost smile became an actual one, brief and private, and the most beautiful thing she had seen since she came to Texas. Then it went back inside whatever place it usually lived, and he was serious again. "I need you to tell me everything," Pharaoh said. "Word for word, as close as you can get. Not the summary, the actual words." She told him again slowly, and this time he listened with a different quality of attention, the listening of someone building something from the information, fitting pieces together. When she finished the second time, he sat back in his chair and looked at the fire. "He mentioned the water rights directly," he said. "He mentioned the management of the creek. He implied rather than stated. He always implies." Monroe was quiet for another moment. "He cannot take the rights without Samuel Birch's agreement, and he cannot take the rights from Samuel without taking mine first." The legal argument he used against the Delgados was built on a specific provision of the 1866 Land Act, and it only applies to land titles that transferred during certain windows of the Reconstruction period. "My title does not fit those parameters. My lawyer has confirmed that 3 times. He looked at her. "What Pharaoh is doing now is looking for pressure he can apply to make me sell voluntarily, because he cannot take the land from me legally." "And he thought I was that pressure," Henrietta said. "Yes, because of the lantern, yes." They were looking at each other across the table, and the fire was the only sound in the room, and the weight of what was unsaid between them was considerable. "Monroe," she said, and his name in her mouth surprised them both because she had never used it before. She saw his jaw tighten very slightly, the way a man's jaw tightened when something mattered. Why the lantern? Not the summary, the actual reason. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I watched you walk that road the first week you were here. It was dark, and the road past the oak is rough, and you were walking it alone every evening because your work kept you late. I thought that it was wrong that you had to do that without a light." A pause, and then "I thought about it for 2 days and I put the lantern up." "That is still the summary," Henrietta said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "I did not want you to be alone in the dark," he said. "I did not want that to be the truth of your evenings here. You came a very long way to do good work, and the least this country owed you was a light to walk home by." He stopped. "I am not making a claim on you. I want to be clear about that. The lantern was not meant as a courtship gesture or a manipulation. It was just a light." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it matters." The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees and the red hound shifted on the porch. "I think," Monroe said carefully, "that we need to address the Pharaoh situation before we address anything else." "Agreed," Henrietta said, "but I want to say one thing first." "All right. When the Pharaoh situation is resolved," she said, "I would like to have a conversation about something other than the Pharaoh situation." He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and whatever he was feeling was very controlled and very present, and he said, "Yes, I would like that too." They spent the next hour at the table with the fire and the coffee, planning. Monroe was precise and methodical about it, laying out what he knew and what he needed, and what Pharaoh's likely next moves were. Henrietta contributed what she had observed and heard in town, which was considerable, because she had been paying attention for 2 months, and she had a schoolteacher's habit of filing away information for later use. Together, the picture that emerged was one of a pressure campaign that was reaching the end of its nonviolent options, and would soon need to either escalate or abandon the effort. Monroe's lawyer, a man named Thomas Garrett who practiced in Austin, had filed a counter-complaint with the Texas General Land Office challenging the method by which Pharaoh had obtained the Delgado title. This was a long process, but it was a legitimate one, and if it succeeded, it would invalidate Pharaoh's legal strategy for the entire region. That was why Pharaoh was pushing hard now. He was trying to complete his acquisitions before the complaint could be adjudicated. Samuel Birch was the immediate vulnerability. If Pharaoh could get Birch's agreement and then Monroe's, he had the creek. Monroe had been planning to speak with Birch, but had hesitated because Birch was a proud man and Monroe did not want to appear to be managing him. Henrietta pointed out with some directness that Samuel Birch's pride and Monroe's sensitivity to it were a luxury they could not currently afford. "I will speak with him," Monroe said. "We will speak with him," Henrietta said. "He likes me. He has 3 grandchildren in my school, and he brings me pears from his tree every October. I have standing there that you do not." Monroe looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, a quality of being seen that was not entirely comfortable because it was entirely accurate. "You are not as new here as you appear," he said. "I have been paying attention," she said. "It is what schoolteachers do." They rode out to Birch's property the following Saturday in Monroe's wagon, Henrietta sitting beside him on the bench with the morning light pale and gold on the limestone hills. It was the first time they had been in each other's company in a deliberate and extended way, and the novelty of it was like a low current in the air between them, present and crackling and carefully managed by both parties. Samuel Birch was a man of 70 with white hair and a face like old saddle leather and eyes that had seen everything Texas had to offer and had made their peace with most of it. He received them on his porch with coffee and the slightly wary cordiality of a man who knew that visitors with good timing usually had a purpose. He was fond of Henrietta. That was evident in the way his face opened when she climbed down from the wagon, and he was respectful of Monroe in the way that men of his generation respected other men who worked their land honestly. Henrietta let Monroe lead the conversation because Monroe knew the legal and financial landscape better than she did, but she stayed present and she watched Birch's face, and she spoke when she saw the old man's resistance rising, and she was good at it, because she was very good at reading what a room needed and giving it that. The conversation lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Samuel Birch had agreed to hold his rights and had accepted Monroe's offer of practical help in the form of one of Monroe's ranch hands helping with fence repairs through the winter, which addressed the most immediate physical pressure Pharaoh had been applying. He had also, and this was Henrietta's particular contribution to the conversation, agreed to write a letter to his son in San Antonio, who was a lawyer, explaining the full history of the situation. The son had not been told everything because Birch was proud, and this was costing them a legal resource they had not known was available. Driving back toward Redemption Creek in the afternoon light, Monroe was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You are very good at this." "At what, people?" "Understanding what they need to hear and how they need to hear it." Henrietta looked at the road ahead. "It is the same thing teaching requires," she said. "You cannot simply deliver information and expect it to be received. You have to understand the person before you can reach them." "I am not like that," Monroe said without apology. "I understand land and animals and structures. People are harder for me." "I noticed," she said. "You are good with them anyway in your own way. You just do it differently." "How?" She thought about it. "You do it through action," she said. "You do not explain yourself to people or charm them or persuade them. You simply do the thing that needs doing and let it speak." "The lantern," she said, and let the word settle. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the road. "That is a generous interpretation. It is an accurate one." He glanced at her then, and she looked back, and they were close enough on the wagon bench that she could see the particular gray of his eyes clearly, not flat gray but layered, like limestone with many different rocks compressed together, and she thought that she had probably been in love with this man for longer than she had admitted to herself. Clement Pharaoh made his next move in the first week of December. It came in the form of a letter to the school board, written on Pharaoh Land Company stationery, and signed by Clement Pharaoh himself, raising concerns about the professionalism and moral character of Redemption Creek's current schoolteacher, who had been observed on multiple occasions in the company of Monroe Lockhart, in circumstances that raised questions about her suitability as a role model for the community's children. The letter was shown to Henrietta by Jasper Prout, who had the decency to look uncomfortable about it, though not quite enough decency to keep it from being shown to the other board members first. She read it standing in Prout's office on a cold Tuesday morning, and she felt the particular cold of being targeted, of being made into a weapon against someone who had not harmed you, and the anger that rose in her was clean and sharp and very focused. She told Prout that the letter was a transparent attempt by Pharaoh to pressure Monroe Lockhart through her professional standing, that there was nothing improper in her relationship with Monroe Lockhart or in her conduct generally, and that if the board chose to act on Pharaoh's complaint, she would file a response with the county superintendent that included the full context of Pharaoh's land acquisition practices in the region, which she had documented carefully because she was a school teacher and documentation was second nature. Prout blinked at her. He was not, she had decided, a bad man. He was a cautious one, which in certain circumstances amounted to the same thing, but he was also a man who respected nerve, and she had nerve. "The board will not be acting on the letter," he said, finally. "I am glad to hear it," Henrietta said, and left. She went directly to the sheriff's office, which was where Monroe was, because she had sent him a note that morning when she first heard about the letter. Sheriff Dan Radnor was a broad and deliberate man who had kept the peace in Redemption Creek for 8 years, through a combination of legitimate authority and the kind of pragmatic fairness that made people trust him even when they did not like his decisions. He was reading the letter when Henrietta arrived, his reading spectacles on the end of his nose, and he looked up at her over them when she came through the door. "Miss Merritt," he said. "Sheriff," she said, and looked at Monroe, who was standing with his arms folded by the window, and who looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, relief and fury and something warmer underneath both. "Pharaoh's moved from land pressure to character attacks," Radnor said, setting the letter down. "That suggests he's getting desperate." "Or escalating," Monroe said. His voice was flat. "The letter to the board is a warning. He's telling me what he'll do to her if I don't deal." "He will not get anything from the school board," Henrietta said. "Prout confirmed the board will not act." Monroe looked at her sharply. "You already spoke with Prout." "I went there first thing." Something flickered across his face. He turned back to the window. Henrietta had the sense that he was managing himself very carefully. "Here is what I can do," Radnor said. "I can write to the county sheriff and copy the state ranger office about the pattern of activity by the Pharaoh Company in this region. Fence cutting, arson, character attacks, potential coercion. Individually, each incident is small. Together they paint a picture. Rangers have been looking at the Pharaoh Company in other counties, and an inquiry in this jurisdiction could accelerate what your lawyer is doing in Austin." "Do it," Monroe said. "I plan to," Radnor said mildly. "I'm telling you as a courtesy. This is my town, and that man is playing games in my town, and I am tired of it." They left the sheriff's office together, Monroe and Henrietta, and walked out onto the main street of Redemption Creek in the December cold. The sky was the color of pewter, and the wind had the bite of real winter in it, and Henrietta pulled her coat tighter. They stood on the boardwalk for a moment and Monroe said nothing, which was completely normal except that this particular silence had a charge to it. "Are you all right?" she said. "I am angry," he said. "I know. He went after you specifically. His voice was very controlled. He did that to send me a message. The fact that you had already handled it before I could do anything about it is something I am still working through. I did not handle it to prevent you from helping," she said carefully. "I handled it because I was the one standing in front of the problem." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That is not the part that bothers me." "What part bothers you?" "That you had to handle it at all," he said. "That my presence in your life has given Pharaoh a tool to use against you. That I have made you a target." "Monroe." She said his name the way she had said it at his kitchen table, with a deliberateness that made him still. "You have given me a light to walk home by every evening for 4 months. You have not made me a target. Pharaoh made me a target because he is a man who uses whatever is available, and if it had not been you, it would have been something else. Please stop trying to shoulder the responsibility for other people's corruption." He looked at her for a long moment in the cold December street, and the people of Redemption Creek moved around them on the boardwalk, and it was possible that several of them noticed and cataloged the specificity of the way Monroe Lockhart was looking at Henrietta Merritt, but neither of them was attending to the people of Redemption Creek just then. "You said," he began, and then stopped. "Yes," she said, because she knew what he was trying to say. "At the table. You said when this was resolved you wanted to talk. I still mean it. It is not resolved yet." "No," she agreed, "but it will be." He nodded, a single slow nod that was also a promise, and they went their separate ways on the main street of Redemption Creek, and the sky opened up, and the first snow of winter, thin and brief and beautiful, began to fall on the limestone rooftops and the cedar hills. December was full. Monroe was in contact with his lawyer in Austin every week, and the counter-complaint with the land office was making progress, slow but definite. Sheriff Radnor had written his letter to the state ranger office and received a response indicating that the rangers already had a file on the Faro Company's activities in 3 Texas counties and were interested in Redemption Creek specifically. Samuel Birch's son, whose name was Edward, and who turned out to be not only a lawyer but a good one with a particular appetite for land fraud cases, made the journey from San Antonio in the 3rd week of December and spent 2 days in Redemption Creek talking to people and reading documents. Henrietta hosted a small supper for Edward Birch and his father at Widow Calloway's parlor, because it was her space and Widow Calloway approved of the gathering, and Monroe came, and it was the first time he had been in her rented rooms, and she was acutely aware of that. He sat at the table where she ate her breakfasts and read her students' papers in the evenings, and he was careful and attentive, and said almost nothing, except when Edward asked him direct questions about the legal history of the water rights, at which point he was extremely precise and useful. And afterward, when Samuel and Edward had walked back to their horses and Widow Calloway had gone to bed, he stood in the doorway of the parlor with his hat in his hands and said, "Thank you for tonight." "It was a supper," she said. "It was more than that, and you know it," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I know it." He stayed in the doorway, and the fire was low and the widow's house was quiet, and he said, "Henrietta," and her name in his mouth was different from anything she had expected, careful and certain and like something he had been saving, and she felt it in her chest. "Yes," she said again, because she did not trust herself to be more specific. "When this is over," he said, "I would like very much to spend time with you, not to solve a problem, just to spend time with you, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He nodded that single slow nod. "Good," he said. And he put his hat on and walked out into the December dark, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the lantern was burning faithfully on the live oak at the bend in the road, which she could just see from this angle, and she thought that this was the exact shape of the thing she had been looking for when she left Virginia. She had not known its shape before, but she knew it now. Christmas came and went, quiet and cold. Henrietta spent Christmas Day with the widows and older women of the town, in a gathering that was both practical and genuinely warm. Monroe spent it at the ranch and sent her a small package through the mail on Christmas Eve that contained a bar of good soap from San Antonio and a pair of leather gloves appropriate for cold mornings, and a note in his square handwriting that said, "I noticed yours were wearing thin." No signature, but she did not need one. She sent him back a copy of a book she had found in the general store's small lending collection, a natural history of Texas flora and fauna that she thought he would use. She included a note of her own that said, "For the man who knows the land but perhaps not all its names." She signed it H, because she could not quite bring herself to sign it Henrietta yet, and the compromise satisfied her. January brought the resolution, not all at once, but in a decisive cascade that had the feeling of a dam finally giving way after months of pressure on the structure. The Texas State Rangers opened a formal inquiry into the Faro Land Company's acquisition practices in the Hill Country region. This was not public initially, but it became public within a week in the way that everything became public in a small town, through the quality of silence that gathered around certain names and certain conversations. Clement Faro's land agent left Redemption Creek abruptly on a Tuesday, which was noted by everyone. Edward Birch filed a formal challenge to the Delgado title transfer in the district court in Austin, which Monroe's lawyer Garrett coordinated with from his end, and the combined legal pressure was significant enough that the Faro Company's lawyers in San Antonio sent a letter requesting a meeting. Monroe rode to San Antonio in the second week of January with Garrett and Edward Birch, and he was gone for 5 days. And those 5 days were the longest Henrietta had spent in Redemption Creek since her arrival, not because she was frightened, but because she had become accustomed to a specific quality of presence in this place that was currently absent, and she noticed the absence the way you noticed a sound that had stopped. He returned on a Friday evening, and she knew he was back because she saw the lamp in the ranch house windows from the road when she walked home from school, a different quality of light than the widow's lamps or the street lamps of town. She did not go to him that evening because she did not want to appear to be waiting, and she was still, in that particular area of her life, committed to a certain amount of dignity. He came to the school on Saturday morning. She was there marking papers because Saturdays were when she caught up, and she heard his boots on the porch and knew the sound of them before the door opened. He came in with the cold morning air and stood in the doorway of the schoolroom, the small desks and the slate board behind her and the morning light coming through the window, and he looked tired in the way of someone who had done something hard and finished it. "It is done," he said. "Tell me," she said. He sat down in the chair at the teacher's desk, which was her chair, because there was no other adult chair in the room, and she perched on the edge of the nearest student's desk and looked at him and listened. The Faro Land Company had agreed, under the combined pressure of the Ranger inquiry and the court challenges, to relinquish the Delgado title. They had agreed to a settlement that returned the Delgado land, or its fair market value, to the family, with the details to be worked out in court. They had agreed to withdraw from the Redemption Creek water rights negotiations entirely, and Clement Faro had signed a letter indicating that the company had no further claims on any properties in the region covered by the counter-complaint. "Samuel Birch keeps his land," Monroe said. "The Delgados get what was taken from them. The creek stays as it is." Henrietta let out a breath she had been holding, she thought, since November. "And you?" she said. "My rights are intact," he said. "Nothing changes on the ranch." "That is not what I asked," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I am very tired," he said, "and I am relieved. And I have been thinking about a conversation I want to have ever since you sat at my kitchen table in November and told me that I should not take credit for other people's corruption." "I remember that conversation," she said. "You said when this was resolved you wanted to talk." "I have been ready for some time," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands, the calloused, capable hands of a working rancher, and then he looked up at her with the particular steadiness of a man who had made his decision and was going to follow it through. "I am not good with words," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she agreed. "I am going to say what I mean, and it will not be eloquent, and I would like you to hear it through to the end before you respond." "All right," she said. "I noticed you the moment you arrived," he said. "The coach deposited you on the street, and you were wrestling that trunk onto the boardwalk with both hands, and your face said that you would manage it regardless, and I thought that I had never seen someone be so privately determined in public. And I helped you with the trunk, and I listened to your name and your purpose, and by the time I walked away, I was already thinking about you in a way that I had not thought about another person in a very long time." He paused. "I am not a man who acts quickly on things like that. I am careful. I have reasons to be careful. But the evenings when I knew you were walking that road alone, those I could not be careful about. I could not watch you be alone in the dark without doing something, so I did something small." "The lantern," she said. "The lantern," he said. "And every evening when I came to set it and I knew you would walk past it on your way home, I thought about you in a way that was not entirely comfortable because I was not certain what to do with it. I had no intention of placing that discomfort on you. I had no expectation. I just needed you to have a light." Henrietta looked at him in the morning schoolroom, at his tired face and his certain eyes, and she thought about 4 months of lantern light and November storms and a December supper and leather gloves, and a note that said the road is uneven past the bend. "Monroe," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "I came to Texas alone, and I was not afraid of it, but I was prepared to be lonely, because I had been lonely before and I knew how to bear it. And then you put a lantern on the road, and something about that particular act of care undid something in me that I had been keeping very carefully done up, because it was not a grand gesture. It was just light. It was just you thinking about my evenings and deciding they should not be dark, and I have not known what to do with that for 4 months, and now I do." "What do you do with it?" he said. His voice was very careful. "I tell you that I am in love with you," she said, "and that I would very much like to know if that is something we can build something on." The schoolroom was very quiet. Outside the window the January sky was a pale clear blue, and somewhere on the hill country road a horse's hooves made their steady sound, and Monroe Lockhart looked at Henrietta Merritt across a student's desk in a Texas schoolhouse, and everything in his face that was usually contained came forward all at once. "Yes," he said, "it is." He stood up, and she slid off the desk, and they stood in the cold morning light of the schoolroom with perhaps 2 feet of air between them, and then he reached out and took her hand with the careful deliberateness of a man who meant what he did, and she felt the calluses on his palm against her fingers and the warmth of him, and he said, "I have been in love with you since October, and I have been very bad at hiding it, and Clement Farrow figured it out before I said a word to you, which is embarrassing." She laughed, which she had not expected to do, and he looked startled by the laugh, and then something in him released, and he laughed too, quiet and rusty, the laugh of a man who did not do it often enough, and the schoolroom was filled with it, and she thought she would remember this moment, the cold light and the small desks and his hand in hers and both of them laughing in the aftermath of everything, for the rest of her life. What followed was not simple, because nothing in a life worth living is entirely simple. But it was good. It was deeply and consistently good in the way that things were good when they were built on honesty and chosen deliberately by people who understood what they were choosing. Monroe courted her with the same character he did everything else, which was to say without performance and without wasted motion, but with complete attention and a quality of care that she found more moving than any amount of eloquence would have been. He came to the school on Saturday mornings and they talked about books and land and the children she taught and the history of the hill country and 100 things. He invited her to the ranch and showed her what he was doing and why, the decisions about the cattle and the water and the fencing and the management of the land, and she listened and asked questions, and he discovered that she had a good mind for the logic of systems, which was not something he had expected but was very pleased to find. He continued to set the lantern on the live oak every evening through the winter, though now she sometimes caught him doing it, because she was paying a different kind of attention. Once, on a February evening when the sunset was extraordinary, she was coming down the road from the schoolhouse and she saw him at the tree, hanging the lantern with the last of the red light on his face, and he looked up and saw her watching, and neither of them was embarrassed. He waited, and she walked to the tree, and they stood together in the last of the light looking at the lamp flame and the darkening sky, and then they walked the rest of the road to the widow's gate together, which was a thing that Widow Calloway noted with great satisfaction from the window. Spring arrived in March with wildflowers and warming stone, and the particular renewal that the Texas hill country did better than almost anywhere Henrietta had ever been. The bluebonnets came up along the limestone ridges, and the cedar trees put out their new growth, and the creek ran full and clear with the winter rain, the same creek that had been the source of all the trouble and was now just water again, doing what water did. Monroe asked her to marry him on an April afternoon when they were walking along the creek bank on his property, the water bright beside them, and the live oaks full of spring leaves, and the hills green in a way they would not be by August. He had clearly thought about how to say it and then decided to say it simply, which was very much like him. He said, "I want to spend my life with you. I want you to have the ranch as your home if you want it, and I want your evenings to always be lit, and I want to grow old with someone who sees things clearly and says them plainly and does not ask me to be other than I am." She said yes before he finished. She said it clearly and without reservation, because she had made her decision in a schoolroom in January, and she had not unmade it since. They were married in June, in the white church with the blue door, which was also the schoolhouse, and the ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Hollies, who had strong opinions about Scripture and softer opinions about everything else, and seemed genuinely moved by the occasion. Most of Redemption Creek attended, because small towns attended weddings, and because Monroe and Henrietta had each, in their different ways, made themselves important to the community, and people wanted to be present for what happened when they chose each other. Samuel Birch was there with his son Edward and Edward's family, who had driven from San Antonio. James Coles, Monroe's ranch hand and a man who had served in the 9th Cavalry, and come west looking for a life on the other side of the uniform, stood with Monroe's crew on one side of the church, and the schoolchildren's parents filled the other side, and Widow Calloway sat in the front row with her good hat on and wept happily into a handkerchief. The Delgados were not present, because they were in San Antonio rebuilding their lives, but Monroe had written to them with news of the settlement and of the wedding, and they had written back, and the letter had wished them well with a warmth that cost them nothing and meant everything. Henrietta wore a dress of pale green that she had made herself from fabric she ordered from Austin, and she carried wildflowers from the creek bank, and she walked down the aisle of the church and schoolhouse that was the center of her professional life, and she looked at Monroe Lockhart standing at the front of it in his good coat with his hat in his hands, and his face doing the thing it did when he was feeling something completely, and she thought that she had been right to come to Texas. She had been exactly right. The ranch became home. It was an adjustment because the limestone house was not the boarding house, and the rhythms of a working ranch were not the rhythms of rented rooms in town, but she was good at adjustment. She kept teaching, which was never in question. She rode to the schoolhouse each morning on the chestnut horse Monroe bought her in July, a steady and sensible mare named Clara whom she immediately liked, and she taught reading and arithmetic and the history of a country that was still making its mind up about what it wanted to be, and she came home each evening to the ranch and to Monroe. The lantern moved with her. Monroe rehung it on the post at the ranch gate so that it lit the last stretch of the road home. She came around the bend in the road every evening and saw it burning there, warm and steady, and it was still the thing it had always been, which was not a grand gesture but the most consistent and faithful act of care she had ever been offered. In their first winter together, she learned what winter on a ranch actually meant, which was considerably more work than she had theorized. She learned to help with the things she could help with, and to stay clear of the things that required skills she did not have, which was itself a form of competence, the competence of knowing what you did not know. She learned the names of every animal on the property and several of their personalities. She learned that Monroe, alone in the ranch house in the evenings before her arrival, had read extensively and thought carefully about a great many things, and that conversation with him was one of the consistent pleasures of her life. He was not a man who spoke often, but when he spoke it was worth hearing, and the balance between them, her more verbal and his more observational, worked in the way that complementary things worked. By the time spring came again, she knew she was expecting their first child, and she told Monroe on a March evening by the fire with the same plainness with which she had told him she loved him, because she did not know another way to tell important things. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had weight. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was something close to awe, and he said, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "And I am very happy about it." "So am I," he said, and the 3 words carried everything they needed to carry. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold and clear morning when the cedar hills were brown and gold, and the creek ran low from autumn. Monroe's mother, who had come from her home in East Texas for the occasion, assisted the doctor from Fredericksburg who had ridden out for the birth, and Henrietta worked through it with the same concentrated determination she brought to everything. And at the end of it there was a boy, healthy and loud, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's clear brow. They named him Samuel James Lockhart, Samuel for the old man who had held his land with stubborn dignity, and James for James Coles, who had been a faithful presence on the ranch for 2 years, and who received the honor of the name with a quiet grace that matched his character. Monroe held the baby that first evening by the fire with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable, which was exactly what he was handling, and Henrietta watched her husband's face absorb the reality of his son, and thought that this was one of the best things she had ever seen. Widow Calloway visited the following week with enough food to feed the ranch for a month, and pronounced the baby perfect, which he more or less was. Jasper Prout came by with his wife and their daughters, and demonstrated a softness for infants that was inconsistent with his general manner and therefore charming. Reverend Hollies christened Samuel James Lockhart in the church on a Sunday in December, and the baby was cooperative about it, which his mother took as a good sign. The Delgado family did eventually return to the hill country. The settlement had restored enough of the land value to give them capital, and Elena Delgado, who was a woman of considerable practical intelligence, invested it in property in a small town 20 miles east of Redemption Creek, where the legal title situation was uncomplicated. They came to Redemption Creek for the 4th of July celebration in 1880, and Henrietta embraced Elena in the street, and Monroe shook hands with her husband Roberto with the warmth of men who had fought the same fight from different positions. And the Delgado children, who were growing fast, ran with the Redemption Creek children in the summer heat of the main street. Edward Birch won the land fraud case in the district court in 1880. The ruling was narrow and technical, but its implications were significant, and it created a precedent that made the methods Farrow had used against the Delgados considerably more legally risky going forward. The Farrow Land Company turned its attention to other regions where the resistance was less organized, which was not a complete victory, but was a genuine one. Clement Farrow himself never returned to Redemption Creek. Word reached them, through the circuit of information that moved through the hill country along with cattle prices and weather reports, that Farrow had encountered serious trouble with the Ranger investigation in another county, and had relocated to New Orleans, which was either true or a satisfying story, and either way it left Redemption Creek in peace. Samuel Birch died in the spring of 1881, peacefully, in his house on his land. His son Edward inherited the property and the water rights, and made clear that they would be managed with the same integrity his father had maintained. Monroe attended the funeral with the whole of the ranch crew, and Henrietta stood beside him at the graveside in the cedar grove on Birch's land with the April sun on the limestone hills, and the old man's passing felt not like defeat but like completion. He had held what was his. He had died in his own house on his own land with his family around him. Not everyone in the hill country could say that in 1881. She was expecting their second child by autumn of that year. The pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps she simply knew better what to expect, and by the time their daughter arrived in February of 1882, a winter baby as her brother had been, Henrietta was prepared and capable, and Monroe was present through all of it in the way he was present for everything that mattered, quietly and completely. The daughter was dark-haired and opinionated from the first hour of her life, and they named her Clara Ruth Lockhart, Clara for the mare who had carried her mother safely to and from the schoolhouse for 3 years, and Ruth for Henrietta's mother, who had died when Henrietta was 12 and who deserved to be remembered. Samuel Lockhart, 2 years old and in the full authority of his opinions, regarded his sister with suspicion for approximately 1 week, and then became ferociously protective of her, which was a character trait he maintained throughout his childhood, and which his parents recognized as entirely paternal in origin, since they had seen the same quality displayed by his father on numerous occasions. Monroe expanded the ranch in 1882, buying an adjacent 40 acres from a neighbor who was moving north, and this required a reorganization of the water management that Monroe worked through with the same methodical care he brought to all practical problems. James Coles had taken on the role of foreman by then, a position he occupied with the quiet authority of someone who had been trusted with large responsibilities before and knew how to carry them. Pete, the 19-year-old who had been learning his trade when Henrietta arrived, was now 23 and a skilled hand who was courting one of the Prout daughters, which Jasper Prout had opinions about, but his wife overruled them. The schoolhouse got a dedicated building in 1882, the first true schoolhouse in Redemption Creek's history, a proper frame structure with real windows and a potbelly stove and enough desks for 30 students. Henrietta had lobbied for it for 3 years, writing letters to the county and making arguments to the school board, and recruiting the support of every parent in town who could be recruited. And when it was built and dedicated in September, she stood in front of her students in the new room and felt the particular satisfaction of something made real from nothing by persistence. Monroe attended the dedication and stood in the back of the new schoolroom with Samuel on his hip and Clara in Henrietta's arms, and Henrietta looked at her husband across the room full of parents and children and neighbors, and the school board members including a slightly sheepish Jasper Prout, and she saw on Monroe's face the specific private pride of a man watching someone he loves be exactly what they are meant to be, and it was one of the best things she had ever seen. And she had been collecting best things for 4 years. On the evening of the dedication, when the children were in bed and the ranch house was quiet, they sat by the fire and Monroe said, "You should be proud of that." "We should be proud of it," she said. "You wrote 3 of those letters. You told me what to say. You said it better than I would have." He looked at her with the almost smile. "That has never been true of anything," he said, and she laughed and he did too, and the fire was warm and the lantern was burning on the post at the gate where it had burned every evening for 4 years without exception, faithful and certain and simply there. It was a life. A real one, with difficulty and weather and sick animals and difficult parents and county politics and years when the rain came right and years when it did not, and all the ordinary extraordinary business of living in a particular place with particular people. Monroe's quietness remained his essential character, and Henrietta's directness remained hers, and these things did not change because they did not need to. What had made them right for each other at the beginning was still true at every subsequent point, which was perhaps the best definition of a good match. Their third child, another son, was born in the summer of 1884 when Samuel was 5 and Clara was 2, and the ranch was running well, and the schoolhouse had 32 students. They named him Thomas William Lockhart, Thomas for the lawyer Garrett in Austin, who had been a faithful ally through the Faro years, and William for Monroe's father, who had homesteaded in East Texas, and passed on to his son the belief that a man's relationship with his land was something worth protecting. Thomas was his mother's child from the beginning, verbal and curious, and inclined to ask why about everything, while Samuel was his father's in the careful and observational way he moved through the world, and Clara was unambiguously herself, which was a force of nature that both parents found equally delightful and challenging. In 1885, 7 years after Henrietta had first arrived in Redemption Creek on a mail coach with a carpetbag and a determination to start over, she sat on the porch of the ranch house on a September evening with the late light gold on the limestone hills, and the children's voices from inside the house, where Monroe was supervising something that involved considerable laughter. The creek was full from early autumn rain, and the air smelled of cedar and turned grass. And on the post at the gate the lantern was burning, as it had always burned, steady and warm against the gathering evening. She thought about the road from the schoolhouse to Widow Calloway's boarding house, and the first time she had seen the lantern hanging from the live oak at the bend, and the folded note that said the road is uneven past the bend. She thought about the man who had put it there without being asked and without expecting anything, who had simply looked at a dark road and a woman walking it alone, and decided that this was a situation he could improve. She thought about Clement Farrow's face when he had smiled at her across her parlor table and told her that sentiment could be managed if one understood what a person was sentimental about. He had thought the lantern was a weakness. He had thought that a man's care for a woman was a vulnerability to be exploited. He had been wrong in the way that people who thought only about leverage were always wrong, which was that he had not understood what the lantern actually was. It was not sentiment. It was not vulnerability. It was character, the simplest and most unshakable form of it. Monroe came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her in the other chair that now lived on the porch as a matter of domestic fact, and he handed her the coffee and looked out at the same evening she was looking at. The hills and the cedar and the last of the gold light. The gate and the lantern. "Samuel asked me today," he said, "why we always have the lantern lit at the gate. What did you tell him?" "I told him that your mother came to this country alone in the dark," Monroe said, "and that I put a light on the road so she would always have a way to find home, and that it became a habit, and we do not break good habits." Henrietta held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at her husband's face in the September evening light. "That is exactly right," she said. "He asked if he could be the one to light it from now on," Monroe said. "He is 5, so there will need to be supervision." "He can start tomorrow," she said. "Supervised," Monroe nodded. The almost smile was on his face, and behind it the full version of the thing she had known was there since the first time she caught him off guard and saw it. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. "Are you glad you put the lantern up?" He turned and looked at her fully, those layered gray eyes and the face that said everything without saying very much at all, and he said, "Every single day." She put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own, and they sat on the porch of their house in the hill country of Texas as the September evening closed in, and the stars came out one by one over the cedar ridges and the creek ran below in the dark, and the lantern at the gate burned on, as it always had, as it always would, faithful and warm and completely certain. Samuel James Lockhart, age 5, appeared in the doorway behind them with Clara at his heels, and Thomas balanced on his hip in an effort that was ambitious for a 5-year-old. "Papa," he said with great authority, "Thomas is being difficult." "Set him down," Monroe said, without turning around. "He will be less difficult with his feet on the floor." Samuel set his brother down with careful ceremony, and Thomas immediately toddled to his mother's knee and grabbed it, looking up at her with an expression of pure and uncomplicated trust. She picked him up and settled him in her lap, and he put his head against her shoulder with the absolute confidence of a child who had never had reason to doubt that the arms reaching for him would always be there. Clara came and leaned against her father's knee, and Monroe put his hand on her dark head automatically, a gesture so habitual that he was not fully aware of doing it. And Samuel came and stood beside them with his father's serious face and his mother's watchful eyes, and looked out at the evening the way his father looked at things, with a consideration that was already at 5, remarkable. The porch held all of them, the 5 of them and the coffee and the last of the light, and the lantern at the gate held its flame against the coming dark, and the hill country of Texas held all of it, the ranch and the road and the creek and the limestone and the cedar and the story of it, which had begun with a woman and a carpetbag and a folded note on a live oak tree, and had grown into this specific and particular and irreplaceable life. Henrietta looked out at the lantern and thought that she would write to her cousin in Virginia, who had been worried about her going so far west alone, and she would tell her cousin that she had been right to come. She would say that the country was hard and the weather was honest, and the people were complicated in the way that all people were complicated, and that she had found on a dark road in September 1878 the shape of the life she was meant to be living, and that it was lit. It was always lit now. Monroe's thumb moved across the back of her hand in the small, unconscious gesture of a man who touched the things he loved the way he touched the land, with attention and without apology, and the evening deepened around the porch of the Lockhart ranch, and the stars were very bright over the Texas hills, and the lantern at the gate burned on into the dark as steadily and as faithfully as the man who had first put it there, and would put it there, or see it put there, for all the evenings yet to come.